So I was just taught this diagram that from a professional about how to deal with emotions, and I thought it was so good that when I started sharing it with my friends, and my friends started saying, "Whoa, that's really cool," I decided I should probably share this with more people because it can have the ability to help more people. Even with everyday, struggles or situations that come up. So it's called the Model of Emotions, and it kind of starts out with a prompting event. A prompting event can pretty much be seen as like a trigger. Let's say your girlfriend or your boyfriend tells you, I'm going backpacking across Europe for a month, and I will likely not, be able to get in touch with you very much, and I'm sorry you can't come with me. And so let's say this is a trigger for, some intense emotions or a fight or whatever, and, because you get separation anxiety. Or let's say your boyfriend or girlfriend, you're at a concert of some sort, during intermission, sits next to another person of the opposite sex and is rubbing shoulders with them and close to them, and all of a sudden this show starts and you're like, oh, well, where did my boyfriend or girlfriend go for the rest of the movie, and like, how could he or she do that? Things like this. So this diagram, we're going to go over the negative and then kind of how the cycle stops. So basically, from your prompting event, you go over to, you have a thought, you have an assumption, you have an interpretation of what's happening, and I guess I will back up and say overhanging all of this is your vulnerabilities. Now, your vulnerabilities, they can be dynamic or they can be static. Why this might be a valuable diagram for people is because they might have dynamic vulnerabilities, which means trauma, PTSD, whether it was from their back from Vietnam or from, a certain part of their childhood was full of neglect or abuse or something, or, they had a traumatic experience where, they fell off a roller coaster or got attacked by, a dog. It could be anything really here. For static, how it's probably applicable to most people is that you could just be hangry. You could just be tired, hungry, and stressed that day, where, something you might normally be able to handle, you can't because of the vulnerabilities you have going on, that condition you're in. So when you have these thoughts, assumptions, interpretations of the event, you'll have an emotional response. Anger, sadness, fear, and for some people that can vary. That can be, an intense feeling or, difficult to handle. Those emotions can lead to a physiological response. And your physiological response is an increase in your heart rate, like an increase in your breathing rate, an increase in your cortisol levels and your adrenaline. And especially, increased adrenaline, you can imagine that kind of leads you to having an urge, an impulse, saying something you shouldn't say or do, react. And then this can lead to an action. I think that the action would be essentially a fight, is kind of how I've interpreted this diagram. Let's say, so we start here, let's say your girlfriend says she's backpacking for a month, and you might explode on her and say, how could you do that? Why would you, like, I want to support you, but don't you know that that's painful and hurtful to me? I'm going to worry about you. How do you think you're safe? And blah, blah, blah. Or you could say, when your boyfriend or girlfriend and goes and sits across the other room with that person of the opposite sex, you might, when they come back, grab their wrist and pull them aside and say, how could you do that? Why did you think that was okay? Like, I can't believe you. So you get the deal. I guess what's most traumatic and where this all falls apart or laces together is this leads to an outcome. And that outcome, especially with handling it the ways that I just described, the outcome could be your boyfriend or girlfriend saying, you know what, I can't take you to these events anymore. I can't take you to these movie events anymore. And the girl might be like, what, I can't go on trips anymore? I can't, be an independent woman? Generally, this involves a lot of guilt, anger, shame. And when this happens, it kind of feeds back into more prompting events, kind of feeds back into more vulnerabilities. And you can see why, if this happens too many times, you wonder, why are we even together? The detours out of this, the way that this diagram proves to be very helpful, is that there's four major ways out of it. So that instead of cultivating negative experiences, if you find yourself experiencing them, there's four ways out so that you can reverse the cycle, so that you can have positive experiences with someone if you're, having difficulties. The first one here is basically mindfulness. Mindfulness underlies all of your ability to break the cycle. Basically awareness. If you can recognize that your thought is really an assumption that you shouldn't be making, you might be able to redirect your thinking right away. You might be able to use positive self-talk to say, you know what, I can't make assumptions. I have to give my lover the benefit of the doubt. I really trust them. I think that they're independent and they can do this. Basically, that's your first way out of it. For instance, you might not know that your lover went and sat next to someone at intermission, and you might not know that, that person of the opposite sex, their spouse is sitting right next to them, and it isn't really like they're just naturally that comfortable with each other. Or, he or she that he sat next to, he or she might be mourning. So you don't really know the context. And then, the show started, and they just were like, oh gosh, and they didn't have enough time to get up and sit back next to you, let's say. Being able to recognize that might have been what's going on in advance might be a way to, break yourself of having an emotional response and physiological response, etc., etc. So, emotional regulation is the next way out of this. Emotional regulation is a powerful way to just stop the cycle, because what's cool about this cycle is that anytime you find yourself feeling like unusually shitty or unusually upset or angry, you can, if you're aware enough of that response, you recognize, sort of like the Dalai Lama, that the first person that you upset when you get angry is yourself. You can always stop this cycle if you always recognize that you are feeling something that isn't in line with reality. Emotional regulation, there's a ton of techniques and coping mechanisms out there. A great one is actively choosing to have an opposite action to what you're feeling. Another one could be doing whatever you can to writing it out, that emotional response, instead of choosing to escape, which a lot of people do with drugs or alcohol. Having a positive distraction, that's also great. There's also, doing kind of a fact check, or evaluating, okay, what are the pros and cons of acting certain ways. All of this takes being mindful, being aware. You can also choose to take care of yourself that night and take a nice hot bubble bath instead of being really upset. The next one, how to break the physiological response. This one's kind of cool because it involves like biological hacks. So one way to look at this, or one way to go about that is intense exercise. I think is one that a lot of people know about. There's also the cold water technique. So if you dump your head in ice water, apparently you can initiate the dive response in your brain, and you can lower your heart rate and your breathing rate and sort of reset yourself. I think that also has to do with like stepping out into really cold weather can also do that for you. Another one I think I've heard about with this diagram is breathing. And we all know about that. If you can get your breath rate down to a point where you fully maximize relaxing your parasympathetic nervous system, that's a great way to stop the cycle as well. Okay, so the last spot here is, let's say all of this is happening, this whole side. And it's basically interpersonal skills. I don't have a lot of room here, but interpersonal skills is basically good communication. You can do this by, instead of reacting to that person with hostility, you can basically say, look, I feel this way. And you can use I statements rather than you statements. It's very important to validate the other person's emotions. There's a lot about being a good communicator that goes a long way and can be effective in breaking the cycle too. So basically, if you can do all this, you can accumulate positive experiences. I hope this is useful as it was for me and all the other people that have shared it with me and talked with me about it, and I've also shared with others. And I hope that I just keep being able to spread this around so that others can benefit. So, thank you.